I decided I was going to make an Adirondack chair for my back patio, and we'll make it together so I can show you how to do it. Now, let me tell you right now, this is not a beginner's level project. It's a little more complicated than that. There's a lot of parts involved here. There's and there's a lot of angles that you're dealing with and things like that. So it is a little more complex than some of the projects we've done before. Now, I've gone ahead and made this out of construction grade pine, specifically number 2 common, rather than making it out of pressure treated lumber. Now, a lot of people would make one of these out of pressure treated lumber, and the reason for that is to make it more weather resistant. Well, I'm going to take care of the weather resistance a different way, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to apply an exterior grade oil-based stain to this. Now, this is the type of stain you might use on a home if you have a home with cedar siding on it and you're staining that home. That's what I'm going to use on this. I wouldn't want to put that directly over pressure-treated lumber because according to the manufacturers of the pressure-treated lumber, you really need to let that lumber sit for about 6 months before putting any sort of finish on it. All right, I don't want to wait the 6 months, so I'm going to go ahead and stain this with that stain, and that's why I've made it out of white pine, okay? Now, there's a lot of material involved in this. There's a lot of different sizes. I've got 2x4s, I've got 1x4s, I've got 1x8s, I've got 1x2s, bunch of different lumber involved. There's a fair amount of wood involved. You end up with a pretty solid, pretty heavy chair, actually. So you'll need to make some good choices at the lumber yard. Watch out for twisted material because that's really going to mess you up. You really want good flat material that doesn't have any bends in it, and then make sure you give it a chance to acclimate in your workshop, okay? It's all assembled with screws, and by screws in this case, I'm not talking about wood screws, actually. I'm talking about what we would call deck screws, or in other words, a kind of an exterior grade of a drywall screw. And what makes them an exterior grade is they're coated, usually with paint. That makes it so that they're not going to rust on you. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this, okay? I've done videos before where I've talked about not using drywall screws for woodworking, and that the reason for that is you don't want the screw threads to capture in that first piece of wood. You want them to capture in the second so that they can pull the wood together. So the threads in that second piece of wood and the head of the screw work together to act as a clamp to pull it together. We don't have that. So how do we deal with that? Okay. Well, what I've done is I've used a tapered drill bit, and that's a drill bit that's supposed to combine your clearance hole, your pilot hole, and your countersink all in one. And if you don't have one, I'd recommend going that route. They really aren't that expensive, and working that way allows you to drill one hole, or let's say one drilling operation, rather than 3 separate drilling operations, and then run your screws in, and you end up with the results that I'm talking about where you can get that clamping force. If you just drill a straight hole, you're not going to get the clamping force, okay? And the problem I ran into when I went to do this project is finding some good plans for it. And I looked around online, and I could find plans, but I'll tell you, some of these plans I found are really incomplete, and some of them have features that I don't particularly like. Notice the front edge here of the seat. Notice I've got that curved, okay? And notice that the seat back is curved. Those were intentional, and the reason that I did them is to make the seat more comfortable. Now, I've seen a lot of Adirondack chairs that just have that comes up and then there's a sharp angle there. And that's going to end up cutting in the back of your legs right about your knees, and that's not going to be comfortable for anyone, okay? A rounded back is more comfortable for your back than a flat back. So what I really literally ended up doing is taking the 3 plans I found and combining them together. And I did it on the fly. I didn't redraw the plans. This would be complicated to draw, so I didn't do that. I do have some drawings for you, especially the parts like the arm and the leg that we have a specific pattern. I've got a pattern for the tops of the slats here, so I do have some drawings for those types of things available. But I don't have a full set of drawings. You can get that by watching the video. How does it all go together? And really, a lot of the parts are pretty straightforward and pretty simple, so it's not going to be that hard to figure out how to put it together. It is going to take some time, and you do want to take the time to do it. Don't let yourself get rushed because you'll end up doing something wrong, okay? Every time I get rushed, I do something wrong. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me show you how to build this Adirondack chair so that you can build your own, and you can enjoy it for your backyard. And who knows, maybe you can make yourself 3 or 4 for your family. As with any other project, this starts out with cutting up a bunch of material. And I've gone ahead and set up a stop block on my radial arm saw's fence so I can make these pieces all the same length. Now this is the slats for the seat itself. Obviously this idea of using a stop block doesn't work for everything. But when you've got to cut multiple pieces and you want them to come out the same, this is the way to go. I want to show you how I'm doing the layout of the arm here. This is a piece of 1x8, so it's 7¼ inches wide, and I've cut it to 33½ inches long. So the design I'm using here, I've kind of combined some designs to get together, and that's why I'm literally designing it on the board, okay? So I'm going to start with the back of the arm here and come up 4 inches. And I'm going to come over here at 15 inches. Now, the thing about dimensions like these is they really don't have to be exact, okay? What I'm doing is narrowing it out as it goes towards the back. And the reason for that is more than anything to protect people from tripping on it, okay? Or running into it as they walk by. We don't need that arm sticking way out, okay? Now, on the front part here, we want the wider arm because we're going to put a cup holder here. So I now have a line here. And then the next thing is to round the edges. Now I have a circle template that I use for this, and I just pick a size, like right here for these two, the back corners here, I'm going to go with, say, a 2-inch radius, okay? And again, this doesn't have to be perfect, okay? So I'll draw this radius here, and on the front, I'll probably go with the radius a little bit bigger, maybe like 2¼ 2½. Let's see, here's 2½ okay? So I draw those radiuses. Okay, what if you don't have that? Well, there's a can of bug spray, that'll work. There's a can of varnish, that'll work. It really doesn't matter, whatever you choose to use, whatever you have available. I use this template because I have it. So then the next thing I'm concerned about is the cup holder. Now the cup holder needs to be 3¼ inches wide, and that dimension is somewhat important. You go too big, and cups are just going to fall out. You go too small and they aren't going to fit. So it's 2¼ inches. Now I'm centering it this way and bringing it 3½ inches back from the edge, okay? So we measure 3½ inches back, or I'm sorry, 3 inches from the edge. So we measure 3 inches back from the edge, and then we find our center. And then I just drew a couple of crosshairs using my square, okay? And then I drew the circle, and I actually used this template to draw the circle. Or you could use a compass to do it. It would be the same result. But you do need it to be 3¼ inches, okay? And now, depending on how you cut this, you may not even need to draw that circle at all. If you cut this out with a hole saw, it doesn't matter. You don't need it. But if you're going to have to cut it out with a jigsaw, then yes, you want that circle. Now, the one last thing I'm going to do is put a curve here. And this is not something you see on all Adirondack chairs, but it widens the sides out, gives you a little more room for those of us that are a little bit bigger around the middle. Okay? So this curve is a little tricky. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure back 8 inches from the front edge here. And then this, I'm making 14½ inches long. So from that tick mark, measure back 14½ inches, it gives me another tick mark. All right, so how do I do that curve? Well, using a compass means I got to have the compass centered way out here somewhere in the middle of the air, or my board isn't big enough to do that. So here's the cheat that I'm going to use. I'm gonna put 2 little blocks of wood here where my 2 tick marks are. All right, and this one's going to have the tension on it, so I'm going to go ahead and clamp it in place. The reason I'm having to clamp this and use these blocks is because I don't have 3 hands. For some reason, I just don't come equipped that way. So, what this block is going to do for me, kind of put the block in the wrong spot. It needs to be on this side of the tick mark. So it's on the inside of the tick marks, okay? So what this is going to do is hold this end of a flexible steel ruler in place for me. And I'm going to clamp this very loosely because all I want it to do is hold that in place without crushing it down. See, if I clamp it tightly, it's going to be this way, and I'm going to try and get my curve, and I'm not going to have not even curve. If I clamp it loosely, now what I can do is I can take this end of the steel ruler and put it on this block. And then for my center, I've gone, and you see this line here, I've got a tick mark 2 inches up. So now I've got a nice even curve that I can go ahead and draw with my pencil. So there's my layout. There's all the cutting I've got to do to get this piece ready, okay? I need to cut this angle off. I need to round all my corners. I need to cut this curve here. Okay, so now that we've done the layout on the leg, we're going to, the arm, we're going to do the layout on the leg. This board's a little bit longer. It's 36 inches long instead of 33 and a half. Notice I've got some wane here, but that's waist, so it really doesn't matter, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is the basic shape. And by basic shape, I mean, let's get rid of these 3 triangles here. And this one, I just measured back 2 1/4 inches, and I drew myself a line from there up to this corner, and that gave me, this is going to be the front angle along the front leg, okay? So this is where the back leg, this is called the back leg, and the front leg, which is a 2x4, connect together, okay? And then on this end, here I'm coming up 3 inches, and then another 1.5 inches, so it's 3 to here, and then 4.5 to here. And this is 8 inches over here. So this is how the part of the back leg that actually touches the ground here, okay? And this leg ends up sitting at an angle. And then I've got this mark here. That was the 4.5 inches. And I come over here and give myself 15 inches. That's the same dimension actually we used in the arm. And I bring this line over here, okay? So now I've got my basic shape in that I've taken those 3 triangles out. Now I want to curve my edges. This is where this is coming down to the ground. I don't want a sharp corner there that people can run into. I went ahead and just use my circle template here. But you know, this would be one that worked just as well with a can of bug spray, okay? This front one, I want a bigger one because what I'm concerned about here is some chairs will have the slats running up to a square end here, and you end up with a sharp corner there for your leg, and I don't like that. So I'm using a can of, actually this is sanding sealer here, but paint, or this is whatever cork can you've got. You can make this curve, and I'm going to do with this is make the slats that go across from one leg to the other curve around this edge so that there's a radius there, so it'll be easier on the legs, okay? So now I've got that curvature and that curvature, and I want to put a little bit of a swoop into the seat. Again, it's all, I'm trying to make it as comfortable as I can, okay? So I'm flipping around just to make it easier for me to work on. And this is that corner. Remember, this is the top side of the leg here now. So this is a corner. I've got 1.5 inches here because there's a support, a 2x4 support that's going to go here. And I've measured back from the point of the board 7 inches. That's somewhat arbitrary, but that's what I came up with. And then I'm coming in, I've drawn myself a line here 1.5 inches in. So this is going to be like where your backside sits, okay? Your legs are coming across here, and this is just to give a little curvature for your backside to sit into. And I drew a line an inch and a half in from the edge, because this is as deep as I want to go with that swoop. And here's my curvature. This is a lid from a 5-gallon bucket. So I took that point as one point, and this line is the other point, lined up the lid, okay? And that's the back part of my curve right there. So that's how I got the back part. And from there, I came forward about a ½ inch up to this point right here and drew myself a line there. Okay, so this piece gets cut out, this gets cut off, this gets cut off, and all this gets cut off, and what's left here is going to become the leg. Now we need 2 legs, just like we need 2 arms. So I'll make one, and then I'll use that as the pattern to make the other. With the layout of our arms and back legs finished, we're ready to start cutting. Now typically, the best way to make sure you get 2 parts coming exactly the same is to cut them together. So we would take the one we laid out and attach it to the other piece, either with double-sided masking tape or brad nails. Go ahead and cut it out and then separate the 2 pieces. Now, this requires that you have a lot of confidence in either your bandsaw or your jigsaw that you're using, that you're going to get a straight cut, okay? My bandsaw, even with as long as I've had it, has always been giving me a hard time about cutting through thicker material. The blade, no matter how I've got tension and how well I've got set up, all the guides for the blade tends to twist in thicker material. So I'm not going to take the chance. I'm going to cut the pieces separately. Now you can do that too. It's just a little harder to get them exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the first piece and sand the edges, get it all the way I want, and then use it for a pattern for the other piece and draw it on there and then cut the other piece. Now, there's a third option we could do. If we're going to make a bunch of these, then really what we're better off doing is making ourselves some templates. And then we could use the template to make sure the parts are equal. All right, so we make a template out of, say, 1/2 inch MDF. That's pretty typical material to use for making templates. Then we would rough cut the pieces, say 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch outside the line, making sure we stay outside the line. Attach the template to the part, and then use a straight bit with a bearing on it in a router to clean it up and make sure it's really clean. Now the benefit of doing it that way, one is of course we get exactly identical parts, but the second benefit behind it is that we really get much smoother edges than if we cut them and then we have to go through and sand them. So it's really beneficial to do it that way if we have that capability. Well, the bandsaw is the normal way to cut stuff like this out, especially curves. Not all of us have a bandsaw available to us. Well, what do you do if you don't have a bandsaw? Well, the tool to use then is a jigsaw. So I'm going to go ahead and cut part of this out with the jigsaw, just for those who don't have a bandsaw available to them. So to do this, I'm holding my piece in place on the edge of my workbench with the part I'm cutting off overhanging, and I'm using a couple of holdfasts to do that. Now, I've tried cutting a lot of things with a jigsaw at one time or another without using holdfasts, and I don't recommend it. Hold the piece down in some way and you're going to get a better cut. The one problem with using a jigsaw for cuts of this type is it doesn't come out perfectly smooth. It's pretty good, but not as good as a bandsaw will usually get it. So you're going to need to sand this in some ways. Now I have an oscillating spindle sander that I use for that. What if you don't have that? Get yourself a drum sander. You can either make a drum sander or buy a drum sander. They have a set of them at Harbor Freight, which I think are somewhere in the $15 to $20 range. You can put it in a drill press, or you can even do it in a hand drill, and it allows you to cut sand inside curves very well. Okay, so I've rough cut my other arm and my other leg to pretty much match the originals that I had done and laid out, and I'm going to use the originals as a pattern with a pattern bit on the router to go ahead and finish it up so I can get all my curves and everything exactly the same. In order to do this, I'm going to attach the two pieces together with double-sided masking tape. Now you don't have to cover 100%, but you do have to put a fair amount of tape on, especially with a part this big, to make sure that it's actually going to stick together. The other thing we got to watch out for here, now normally when you work with a pattern bit, it's typical to think in terms of the pattern being above the board that you are cutting. We're going the other way around here, and we're putting the pattern on the bottom because I'm going to be doing it on the router table. Okay, it's not any harder to do, but you want to make sure you get it right. Now what makes this so critical is that the bearing that's on the bit has got to line up with the piece that's being used as the pattern, okay, or the template. In this case, the bearing is actually on the bottom because of the way the bit is designed, so therefore the piece that's going to be my template has got to be on the bottom. The other thing I've got, of course, got to do is make sure that the parts that are not being cut, which basically means the straight sides, are lined up absolutely perfectly, okay? Really what I'm concerned about cutting here is this angle and this curve and the curves on the ends. So as long as my ends are lined up straight and this is lined up straight, I'm ready to go. Just so you can see before I start cutting this, here's the bearing, okay, and here's the cutting part. So the bearing is riding on the lower board and is clearing the upper, and the upper is riding on that. So you got to get that height just right, okay? That's critical to making this work out well. So let's give it a go. Okay, we're ready to start assembly. Had a lot of pieces to cut, and as you can see, they're scattered all over the place here. So the way we're going to go about this is we're going to start with the two sides. All right, like the armrest and leg on one side and the armrest and leg on the other side. Make those two structures, and then we will attach those together. Then we can go ahead and put in the seat back and the seat itself. So I've taken and attached a framing square to my workbench top here, and what it's here for is to act as obviously a square so that I can get my legs absolutely 90 degrees to the bottom, okay? So if I use this and my table here as a reference, I can make sure I get things straight. Before I attach the leg or the back leg to the front leg, I've got a small piece here I'm going to attach. This is really as a support. Now, there's a couple things I've done in this design that might be considered overkill, and this is one of them. I mean, a 2x4 by itself is going to be plenty strong enough, okay? But I've gone ahead and added this piece in so that the back leg is actually resting on top of this, not just on screws going through the wood. One of my considerations here is that this is going to be sitting out in the weather. And any hardware is eventually going to assist in causing the wood to rot. all right, right around that hardware. So I really don't want that to happen, and to help prevent it, I'm going overkill in my design, and I'm also using glue in addition to the screws. This piece, this support piece, is actually not as wide as the leg, and there's a reason why I did it that way, and it's basically because the edges of 2x4s, the corners, are always radiused, okay? And so to avoid having a dip where that radius comes in and then I got the other piece there, I'm just making this other piece narrower, and it looks like it fits together. I'm also using outdoor screws. These are screws like you would use for putting a deck together. Normally I wouldn't do this with these kind of screws. I'd use wood screws of some sort. But due to the fact that this is sitting outdoors, I'm really more concerned about it being able to handle the weather than anything else. So I can line up my leg piece with the front edge of this and the edge of my workbench. Okay, and I forgot to put some glue there, so let me draw a line. And we'll go ahead and add some glue. Notice I'm not doing a really neat job of gluing. The glue is just for additional support. Funny things happen to wood when it's sitting outside, and as you can see, I'm not using pressure treated wood. And the main reason I'm not using pressure treated wood is because my intent is to stain this with an exterior grade stain. You could still stain it with an exterior grade stain if you're using pressure treated wood, but you'd have to wait 6 months to do it. Most of this is being put together with 1 5/8 inch long screws. There are a couple places where I'm going to be using 2-inch screws. Okay, so I've got this angle set up the way it needs to be. Now, don't count on this line being absolutely right, okay? It may not be, but the dimensions work out right if we do what I just did, all right? So now, you notice I've got this sitting on a block here, and that's just for a spacer. So now I can go ahead and put the back leg piece in, which is this piece. You notice the angle cut. That angle cut is so that when this piece sets on there, you gotta turn the right way, I've got the angle for my back, okay? So this needs to be 8 inches forward, or 8 inches from the very, very back here. So once again, let me slide it under here. Once again, I need to use a square. Since my framing square is occupied, I'll use a smaller square. Again, I'm lining it up with the edge of the workbench, trying to make sure that it is right where I want it. Okay, so put some glue down. Another reason I'm being a little sloppy with my glue is that I really don't want any glue that is giving me squeeze out, because that's going to mess up my efforts in staining. So okay, so this is in place. It's square, lined up with the bottom of this. Now I can go ahead and screw it in. Okay, I've said before that I always make at least one mistake on a project, and sure enough I did so again. And that is that I installed both the front leg and this back support on the same side of my back leg. Okay, one's got to go on the outside and one's got to go on the inside. The front leg goes to the outside and this back one goes to the inside, because it's ultimately going to hold this piece, which is part of the back support, okay? So I had to take it apart, and then the challenge was to try and figure out how to get it square, putting it back on. And what I've done is put a square here that's coming off my bench dogs, which I know are lined up square parallel to the edge. And so now I'm ready to reattach this. So put a little glue on here. Now the glue that was on there before is a bit of a problem for me because, as I said, I'm intending to stain this. And the way I'm going to solve that problem is by sanding off the rest of the glue. I've scraped off what I could with a putty knife, and I'm going to have to sand off the rest of it. So, oh, here's the screws I was using. Okay, so as you can see, the 2x4s are on opposite sides. This is the inside, this is the outside. Now when I make the other one, I have to do it the exact opposite, so I don't want to forget that, okay? So there's only one more thing to do to this, and that's to add a couple supports. This is the right side leg, so it's the one that gets the drink holder, and it's going to sit up here like this, okay? Now, here in the back, I don't have anything holding this up, so I'm going to add a support block, which is going to hold that. And while I'm at it, I'm going to add one here in the front as well to give extra strength there. Otherwise, this is kind of cantilevered out there, and it could break off. Where'd my square go? Somewhere in all this, I've got a square. Yep, I put that in the right position. So this, of course, just gets screwed on there with a couple screws. Now, I said there was a couple places I'm going to use 2-inch screws, and this happens to be one of them. If I run a 1 5/8 screw in, say here, it's not going to hardly go into the 2x4 at all. So that's why I mentioned that I needed a few 2-inch screws. This doesn't have to be absolutely square and perfect. Eyeball square is good enough. Okay, so here's our leg assembly. This is the right side, and I know it because the back leg is inside of the front leg, okay? So here's my right side armrest, and I know it's the right side because it's got the hole in it for the drink holder. So this sets up here like this, and it's located on the edge and back here up against this piece. Now the only other measurement is I drew a line 3 inches up from the back end, and that I want that to line up with the back of this post, okay? And so that puts it right about there. So that's where this is going to end up. And I'll put a couple screws here and one screw here. Again, I'm going to apply a little bit of glue. You might be asking yourself, why is he putting glue in end grain? Because glue in end grain is still stronger than end grain with no glue. And this doesn't have to be so perfect that I'm bothering to use a gauge block or anything. I'm using an eyeball with that line there. And we'll go ahead and screw this in. Again, I'm measuring this off the face here. Okay, that's how I know my alignment. I want one screw going into my angle bracket. And I want 2 more going into my 2x4. So my 2x4 ends here. Okay, so this is one side totally finished, and now I need to make the other side, and then we'll attach the two together. It's always a good idea to round over the edges of any piece of wood that's going to be on a seat or a back where it's going to come in contact with your flesh. Those sharp edges can dig in after a while and get really uncomfortable. And of course, whenever you set up a roundover bit, and I'm using a 1/4-inch roundover bit here, you want to do a test cut in a piece of scrap to make sure that it's actually going to cut the way you expect it to. So I'll be rounding all 4 sides of the face side, the sides that will be facing up. The back side really doesn't matter. So I've got my seat slats cut and I've pre-drilled them so that they're going to be easy to put on. And the length matches this piece back here, which actually supports the lower end of the back. So I need to attach at least the front end of it here because this is what's going to pretty much hold things together while I get the back in place. I'm not going to put them all in right now, but I'm going to put at least a few slats in. I've marked here on the leg where these attach so that I can be sure to put them in the right spot. Okay, now because of this curvature, if I go with these wide pieces, I've got a lot just kind of hanging out there in the air. So I've cut myself just a few pieces that are a little bit narrower. And I'm going to use this just for this curvature, and then I'm going to go back to the wider pieces. So these wider pieces are 1.5 inches wide, and the narrow pieces are 1 inch wide. And I'm going to use a carpenter's pencil as a spacer so I can keep my spacing consistent in how I locate these. Carpenter's pencil is 1/4 inch thick, so it makes a great spacer for a lot of different things. And part of the reason I'm spacing this is I don't want my pieces right up next to each other and forming like a crack there that leaves and stuff can get caught in. And 1/4 inch they can still get caught, but it's less likely. Looks like I'm going to need a bit extender to be able to get this next one in. And now we're back to the wider pieces. And I want to make sure I run them flush up with the edge of my boards here. Okay, I'm on the opposite side of my workbench for a change, and we're ready to put the support pieces in for the back. This one's a little tricky to get in place because of everything that's there, more than anything to screw it in place. I've gone ahead and applied glue, and I want to glue these pieces. You may have noticed I didn't put glue on the seat slats, and there's a reason for that, and that is if there's anything that's ever going to have to be replaced on this chair, it's probably the seat slats, because those will have water sitting on them, may cause some deterioration of the wood, even with some sort of a protective sealant on it. Now I'm using a bar clamp to pull this in, because if I got those front pieces a little bit crooked, I'm going to be spreading this back end, and I don't want that happening. So we'll go ahead and screw these in. I'm using a right angle drill because it's a little hard to get in here. And then we'll put some glue up here. We've got another support. Now this is actually the support that does most of the load bearing, I guess you could say it, because if you try and lean back on the seat, this is the one you'll be pushing against. This one is just kind of holding the bottom end in place. So this is the more critical one. Therefore I'm going to use a little bit longer screws here, 2.5 inch screws, just to make sure it's well supported. Okay, now with this in place, I'm ready to go ahead and put the seat slats in, or the back slats in, and then finish putting the seat slats in. I'm here on the other side of my workbench for a change, and it's mostly because I'm trying to find an angle where you can see what I'm about to do, putting the back slats into the chair. Now I've put the front part of the seat, but I haven't gone all the way back because I need access to this lower stretcher here to attach the back slats to. So I've got a lower and an upper stretcher. And I've gone ahead and pre-drilled all the holes in my back slats. Now, the back slats are cut of 3 different widths of material, okay? The middle one is 1x5, so it's 4.5 inches wide. The ones that go on either side of that are 1x4, so they're 3.5 inches wide. And then the very outer ones are also made from 1x4s, but they've been ripped down to 3 inches. So they're 3 inches wide. Okay, so we've got 3 different sizes, and then as you can see, there's curves here. I just drew up a template for this, or pattern for this, and on the computer, and then that's how I did it. And then I've rounded off all the edges, just like I talked about rounding the edges on the seat slats. I rounded the edges on the back slats so that there's not that sharp edge that might dig into your skin, okay? People will sit on these things in swimsuits and whatever, have skin exposed, so we need to be concerned about that. And then, as I did with the seat slats, where I was using the carpenter's pencil to give me that 1/4 inch spacing, I'll be doing the same on the back slat. So, now, I find it much easier when I'm installing something like this. Instead of trying to hold it by hand, I will clamp it in place. All right, a lot of people try and hold it by hand, and I've done that, and it's just not worth the extra effort. So let's go ahead and put some screws in. Another problem with the clamps is sometimes they get in the way of being able to see what you're doing. Okay, so the first one is now screwed in, and the second one goes next to it, obviously. Again, as I mentioned, I'm spacing off the bottom stretcher here, and I'm using my carpenter's pencil to give me the spacing between them. So, I've got the clamp in the wrong hand. Okay, so top one is set where it needs to be. Whoop, top one was set where it needs to be. Try that again. Yes, these clamps can slip at times because I'm really not on a square edge here. I really should have a caul of some sort, but I don't. Okay, so we'll drop this pencil down to the bottom one to give us the spacing. And then I can move the pencil back up to make sure I get the spacing right on the top one. So it's really rather straightforward, especially if you clamp it in place and you don't have problems with it giving you difficulty. Now on this last one, I'm going to have the 2 screws on the bottom, but I'm actually only going to have 1 screw on the top. And the reason for that is that the way my brace here is set up, I end up with a gap between the back of this on the outer side, and it's not going to screw well anyway. So rather than fight with it, I've just decided to not bother with the screw. I'm going to have plenty of screws to hold it in as it is. And then the top one to get the spacing right. Okay, so I've still got 2 more slats to go in, but they'll go in the same way as these 2, and we'll have the back done, and then I can go ahead and finish out the seat. I need to put one more stringer on the back of this chair, and I'm going to put it all the way up high, and the main purpose for it is just to keep the boards from warping, okay? Now it's a little tricky to do this because it's up on my workbench. I'm actually going to have to climb a ladder to do it. If I was not doing it on video, I'd probably bring it down on the floor, but then I couldn't get the camera on it. So we'll go ahead and put this in. I'm only going to put 1 screw in each of these. And that's mostly because of its purpose, okay? It's not really intended to provide support. Just to protect from warping. I'm using shorter screws here. These are 1 1/4 inches. Okay, so now we're back to finishing up our seat slats, and you've already seen me do a few of these, the ones in the front. So I'm just continuing with the same thing, again, using my carpenter's pencil as a spacer. I've already pre-drilled the holes in my slats, and so really all I've got to do is run the screws in. So here's our finished Adirondack chair. It's all ready to go except for the stain that I still need to put on it. I'm going to take it outside and I'll stain it outside. So that way I don't mess up my workbench with the stain, and it gives me a little more room to work with. The one thing you didn't see me do is the cup holder. Now the cup holder is just a hole. This is a 3 inch hole cut through here with a hole saw, and then there's a little U here which is just made out of 1x2s screwed together and attached. Okay, you don't have to put a cup holder on yours. I just thought I may as well, because you know, generally when I'm sitting out there, yeah, I like having a cold drink handy, and so that gives me some place to do it. The build went pretty well. I'll have to say I did make a couple mistakes along the way, and really that's not unusual. I make mistakes on things all the time. The trick isn't whether or not you make the mistakes or avoiding mistakes altogether. The thing is, how do you fix it? Okay, and I've had to do a couple things to fix it. But okay, I still ended up with a finished chair, and it looks good, and it's going to be usable, and that's what really counts. So the one thing I will warn you about these chairs, they are pretty heavy. When it comes time to move it outdoors, you might want a hand. Somebody give you a hand. It's bulky, it's awkward, it's heavy, but it's a great, comfortable chair, and it's a fun project to do. Now, like I said at the beginning, this is not a beginner's level project. Could a beginner do this? Yes, I believe a beginner could do it. There's nothing that complicated here, but there's a lot of different techniques you can use, especially in cutting, and to be able to get it all to come out, you might want a little experience under your belt before you start. Nevertheless, when you get done, you'll have that experience. So if you've never done it, don't worry about it, okay? Enjoy the project, enjoy the process, take the time to do it right. And you'll end up with a chair, or maybe even several chairs that you can put on your patio, you can put in your backyard. You can sit there and enjoy the cool evenings, or enjoy watching the kids play, maybe in the pool, whatever you happen to have. And it's something that'll last you for years. So, time to make some sawdust.